Happy Saturday, guys. In Galatians chapter 5 this week, and kind of looking still at what Paul has to say to the people in Galatia about living under the constraints of the law versus living under the freedom of Christ. Looking back at the first 4 books, you kind of see that theme running throughout about who's kind of responsible for that. Paul's frustrated about it. Kind of reminds me of something that I think a lot of us deal with, and that is it reminds me of an old commercial. If you're my age, you probably remember it. Back in the day, the rental car company Avis had a tagline that said, "We try harder." I always thought that was such a weird marketing strategy, because it's like, we're not good enough, but we try harder. And I think a lot of us feel that way. A lot of people feel that way about being a Christian, about our salvation, is that we always have to try harder, and that we'll never be number one. We'll never actually be good enough. Had a conversation with a buddy. Actually, 2 of us were having a conversation with a mutual friend about this last year, and the conversation was, I know you know Christ. I know you know what the right way to live. Why are you not doing that? And the response from our buddy was, I've just done too many bad things. Nobody would want me at the church. I know Jesus probably doesn't want me around. I've done too many things to live opposite of what he would want. And I think that's a lot of people's thought, is that we have to get our lives right before we can follow Jesus. And I think we got it totally backwards. We all fall short. We all are not good enough. And that's the point, that what Jesus did for us allows us to have that relationship with him, not anything that we can do. And so I think Paul continues in his frustration, but he finally kind of puts the line in the sand, so to speak. And in the early part of chapter 5, he talks about, all right, you either got to live by the law and be held to that, accountable to that, or you live in the freedom of Christ. You can't do both. You can't have it both ways. You can't stick your foot into the freedom of Christ while staying in the law. You can't do it the other way as well. And he gets really frustrated, and it so much to the point that he says, whoever is leading you and telling you those things, I wish bad things for them. That they're the ones causing a lot of this, and he's really upset about it. Around verse 12, 13, he goes and kind of switches his gears and talks a little bit about still the differentiation, but he talks about living by the Spirit and living by the flesh. The living by the flesh is living in the, really kind of equates it to living under the law. If you're living under the law, you're living by the flesh. And he says there, you can't do both. You can't satisfy the flesh and live in the freedom of the Spirit. And he does mention that this freedom that we talk about is not just a free card to be able to do whatever you want. He says, don't accept this freedom as being able to live by the flesh. This freedom, you still want to be humble. You still want to love others. He actually says that if the freedom to fulfill the greatest command, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. And he talks in verses 15, he says, because if you fight with each other and devour each other, what good is that? I think that's something we deal with nowadays. We even those that try to live by the Spirit, we still have so many divisions and so many times that we're arguing and fighting with each other, and nobody wins. And nobody wins at that. And so I think that's what Paul's kind of trying to get at is, hey, if you're going to live by the Spirit, you've got to be fully committed to that. And I don't want you living halfway in the Spirit and trying to indulge the flesh and the sinful nature as well. And so then he kind of describes some of the sinful nature. And in verse 20, he flips and describes the fruits of the Spirit. And basically telling us that your heart is what matters. What comes out of your heart is what is important. And those are the fruits of the spirits that he shares there. And I think as we live and we try to do and read the Bible, it all goes back to that, to what is in your heart. What do people that you meet say about you and have about, is your heart right? Is your heart evident in the way that you treat other people? Do you treat with kindness, gentleness, patience, goodness? Those are the things, when they're there, they're evident that you're living by the Spirit. And he says, if you're not, you need to, because that's the only way to live a life of fulfillment with Jesus Christ. And so as we wrap this up and we're getting close to the end of Galatians, it's interesting to me that the big thing is you can't be both. You can't be lukewarm. He talks about that later. We see the church in Revelation when he talks about it's better not to be lukewarm, better to be one way or the other. That's the same thing right here, because Paul is telling us you can't be a little bit into the world. You've got to be fully committed. And so there's not an average Christian. You're either radical about it or you're not. And that's really what Paul's message is. And I think we often try to live a little bit of both. And so I'd encourage you this week to go out and try to think of ways that you can live more purposefully for Christ. So y'all have a great week and live on purpose and with purpose.